Something you may be unaware of is every year during Lent, we have people coming into the church. And so for 3 weeks in a row, there's the scrutiny. So we're celebrating the second scrutiny today, and at this Mass specifically. But when you celebrate the scrutiny, the gospel is different. Always fun for the priest to figure that out. So if you came to 8:30 or 5:30, you would have heard the gospel of the Prodigal Son. But at this Mass only, it's the man born blind. So does Father have two homilies? No. He has one, and it's on the Prodigal Son. But because it's so well known, hopefully you can think of that parable yourselves. And we know the story, right? The son asked for his inheritance early, basically saying, I'd rather you're dead, Father. And he leaves his father, goes, spends all of his money on a life of sin, finds himself eating with pigs, and finally decides that he's going to go home, goes home, and the loving embrace of the Father. But I wonder, what would the prodigal son say if we asked him this question? Would you do it differently if you had it all over to do again? Would you do it differently? I think that right away, when he is thinking about that question and what his answer would be, he'd probably have a lot of regret. Regret's that thing that produces these visceral feelings within us, right? That response of deep shame and of something I wish I had never done. So there's probably that going on for the prodigal son. There's a popular show that came out several years ago, Lost. Any of you ever see Lost? I love that show. Catholic writer, a lot of Catholic themes, but there's this character, you do not have to have seen the show to understand this, but there's this guy, his name is Ben Linus, and he's a bad guy. He's a bad guy in the show Lost. He's a manipulative guy, he's a liar, he's selfish, and all he wants is power. And there's this moment in the television show when he has a chance to save his daughter. And his daughter ends up dying, and he allows her to die for his own sake because it benefits him. All that to say, bad guy. Well, there's this moment at the end of the series where he's locked up. He's in this makeshift prison because bad dude, right? So he's locked up. And he breaks free and he runs away. And as he's running away, one of the ladies chases after him and confronts him. And then they have this dialogue. And he says to her, I need you to understand something. I need you to understand that I know I have done so many things that are unforgivable. I could never forgive myself. I watched my own daughter die, and I had the power to save her. So the woman looks at him and says, well, what are you going to do? And he says, I'm going back to the man in black. Now, the man in black in the show Lost is the personification of evil. He represents human weakness. He represents human sinfulness. He represents all of the darkness in humanity. And so the lady says to him, why would you go back to him? What does he offer you? And he says, he's the only one that'll have me. If there's ever been a sin in any of our lives that we thought no one could know, if there's ever been something on your heart that you thought, I could never tell my spouse or my family member, if there's ever been something that you've experienced in your life that you thought, I couldn't even talk to a counselor about that, you know the shame and the experience of feeling like no one else will accept you. In our second reading, that's exactly what we heard just proclaimed. Darkness takes us in, and we feel like we can only stay there. But what do we know about the gospel for the prodigal son? We learn a different way. We don't have to remain, but we can go somewhere. There's this moment when the prodigal son, again, he's with the pigs, and at first I always thought, what's he doing? He's missing the point. He says, if I go back to my father, I'll be a servant. And I always thought, you're not a servant, you're a son. You're not a servant. But it's interesting, though, because in this prodigal son's darkest moment in his life, he knows, even if it's unconscious, he knows that his father, if he goes home, will welcome him and love him, even if it's as a servant. And then you have the most powerful line in that gospel. The prodigal son gets up and he goes. He gets up and goes. See, sin tries to keep us trapped where we are. But the miracle of grace is that we can get up and we can return to the Father. And that's what we're invited to do. To return to the Father who's waiting with open arms to welcome us back in love. And it's amazing for me because every time that I preach and I prepare a homily, something always happens. Sometimes I talk about it, sometimes I don't, but something happens that it's like meant for me in my preparation for homilies. And that happened yesterday. I was talking to this man who I have permission to speak about this. I usually ask if I'm bringing up something with another person, and this is a guy who's thinking about the seminary. And he says to me, Father, I think God might be calling me to be a priest, but I'm a sinner. I'm a sinful man. And I just don't know if you'd want me. And I said to him, well, I know in your life, because we've talked many times, I know in your life that the sacrament of confession has been a big part of it. And he said, yeah, it has. And I said, well, would you be in my office today if you had never experienced God's love and mercy when you returned to the sacrament each and every time? And he said, no. And I said, isn't that interesting? That even in your experience of sin and shame, it brought you to the confessional, and you experienced God's transforming grace and love, that now you want to be a priest. He goes, yeah. And I said the very question I asked about the prodigal son, would you change anything about your spiritual journey? And he said no. Because even his story and his personal history of sin has taught him of God's never-failing love and grace. If the prodigal son was asked that question, I think he would answer with a resounding no. He wouldn't do anything different because it taught him of the Father's love. But here's the challenge for us. Yes, we need to return to God and go back and trust in the Father's mercy. But then there's the other side of it. There's the Father in the prodigal son story. And the Father is generous in showing love and mercy to the Son. How generous are we in showing love and mercy to others? Imagine for a moment, there's someone in your life that's hurt you, and they come to you, and they say, I've sinned against heaven and against you. Would you forgive that person? The challenge for us is to be just as receptive as the Father, that when that person comes to us and says, I've sinned against you, that we can be just as generous in God's loving grace to them. Say, yes, I do forgive you. I love you. We heard in our first reading that God sees not as human beings do, but as he does. Because he doesn't see our sinfulness, he sees us as his sons and daughters. And so the reality for us is that if we're really going to have this spiritual awakening, right? If we're going to have spiritual vision that Christ has, part of it is to see ourselves as God sees us. But the other aspect is to see that God works in other people's lives too. Imagine if someone approaches the Father, approaches me and says, Stephen, will you forgive me? And I say no. It's just like the Pharisees in our gospel who are unable to believe this amazing thing, that this man was given spiritual sight. I'm stuck on that line from the blind person. This is what's so amazing. He came and he opened my eyes. Who could do that if they didn't come from God? And yet you still don't believe. Why would we ever reject that God is doing something in someone else's life? And so my hope and prayer for all of us this weekend is that we have that grace to return to the Father, but also when someone returns to us, and to share that mercy with them as well.